A cross-cultural special education comparison, focusing on the United States and China. Teaching is a profession that is shared by many people all over the world. Most people become educators because they want to make a difference in children's lives. Special educators want to help students who have learning disabilities, emotional impairments, or cognitive impairments that do not allow them to learn the same as students without such disabilities. The United States special education program is not perfect, but has come a long way from what it was 50 years ago. It has made progress through laws passed and processes to help special education students. China is well known for its education program and for producing some of the best, brightest, and hardworking students in the world. I would even go as far to say that China's education system far surpasses the current education system that is in place here in the United States. I bet anyone would have a difficult time finding a person that would argue that statement. However, China is well known for their bright students, but what about the children that struggle or have disabilities that are deemed special? China's special education system sure has struggled, just as the United States, but I would say that the United States is far above China in its respect for students, not just those who are incredibly talented and intelligent. In this paper, I will give details about the United States special education system as well as China's. There are many important factors such as the history, the processes, laws, and categories. I also hope to use Wright's perspective to determine the difference in the way that the countries view special education. The United States special education program has not always been what it is today. Little had been done to help children who were learning disabled. Over 45 million children were not treated equally and given appropriate education until the legislation started to change that in the 1970s. People who were mentally disabled were not allowed to work in the public school. They were either put into state institutions or homeschooled. People who were put into institutions were sometimes treated badly. They were thought of by society as outcasts, and it was better to put them in these institutions than try to help them. Children who had intellectual disabilities or children who were severely handicapped were put into homes. These children had no chance at all. Instead, they were outsiders and forced to go away from society. That kind of thinking may be one of the worst decisions that people have made in history. After the parents and advocates for these children did their part, it had to be made official. The first law regarding special education, Public Law 94-142, otherwise known as the Education for All Handicapped Children, Congress passed this law and President Gerald Ford signed it in 1975. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act had several purposes. First, for all children with disabilities between the ages of 5 and 21, they were guaranteed free appropriate public education. Children now with disabilities were guaranteed the same chance to go to public school as students without learning disabilities. No more were they allowed to be homeschooled or sent away to institutions. A very important process in special education is known as the IEP, the Individualized Education Program. For each child who is eligible for special education-related services, a plan must be made by the MET team, the Multidisciplinary Assessment, and includes a statement of specific special education and related services to be provided to the child. The child must be put in the least restrictive environment. Parents have the right to participate in every decision related to the identification, evaluation, and placement of their child. Parents must give consent for any initial evaluation, assessment, or placement decision. Due process procedures assure rights parents to appeal. The next important factor of special education is the IEP. An IEP is made when the student is first placed in special education program and a review is done annually. The people who are involved in the IEP process is the student, his or her parents, the special education teacher, a general education teacher, counselor, and any special therapists that are needed. The steps of the IEP process start off with a referral. If a general education teacher suspects that a child may be having a learning disability or the child is falling behind, the general education teacher will make a written statement to the school. A verbal recommendation may be used, but is not likely. Everything needs to be documented to protect the student, the staff, and the school. Next, the parents of the student will be notified. Also, they will review the student's case. this is where it might get tricky. Some parents may resist or even refuse the evaluation of their child. The parents then agree to return the form to the school that was sent to their home. The student will be evaluated by the MET team. The MET report must be presented to the IEP within 30 days of the first parent's consent. The IEP team meeting is the next step and is held to see if the child is eligible for services. If the child is eligible, the team will determine the proper steps from there. If the child is deemed to be special education, that they need special education, they will be placed with the proper services and given the proper accommodations and modifications. Now that I've explored the United States special education history, laws, and programs, I will go on to explore some of the same attributes from China's perspective. The progress of China's special education program does not differ a great deal from that of the United States. We can now say that China is probably the leader in the field of education. When it comes to special education, they might be falling behind other countries. In the late 1800s and the middle of the 1900s, China was influenced by Western countries to start special education programs in their country. The majority of the first special education programs were started by missionaries or other types of religious influences. It wasn't until 1960 when the number of schools for children with disabilities increased before they had limited funds. There wasn't enough money to provide the services, and with China being so big, it was cost a lot in the rural areas to provide these services. The countries had no special education support through funding or help from the government. Students with disabilities were most likely just taught skills so they could earn a living. In 1979, special education became a government-funded program. China is identified as having the largest population in the world, with about 13 million people recorded in 2003. Of that population, 364,740 students have learning impairments, visual impairments, and mental retardation. It wasn't until recently that China just started to adapt different categories of special education, such as emotional impairments, autism. For the first about 100 years, it was only visual impairments, hearing impairments, and then being mentally retarded. In the 90s, China slowly started to adopt the learning in the regular classroom movement, something that we in the United States call inclusion. Because of the extremely high cost to fund special education programs or school in rural areas of China, they began to do what they could for students. One major concern for China's special education development is how most of the students are not being representative given the proper modifications, accommodations, or services they need. China is slowly coming around to the fact that there are more disabilities than visual or hearing impairments and mental retardation. One particular disability or disorder that is confusing to most countries is autism disorder, which is also confusing to us here in the United States. There's no specific cause. Psychologists and medical people cannot determine if it is all cognitive in the brain or if environmental factors are included as well. Children with autism have a hard time with social relationships. They tend to focus on one event and they have a really hard time interacting with peers. When this class began, I was completely confused with the Reitzer book and everything that was going on. Once I began to read and process what Reitzer was talking about, it came together for me. There are so many examples of what Reitzer calls a continuum of something to nothing. It is easy to talk about how an antique native artifact that is 100 years old is something. When a person starts to mass produce the artifact and sell it all over the country, that one unique artifact becomes a nothing in Reitzer's eyes. Reitzer theorizes how there are three major concepts, being capitalization, Americanization, and McDonaldization, that are destroying all the artifacts in small town markets. Those artifacts are being mass produced, and the small town markets are being replaced by Walmart. After taking this course, it is easy to see how the somethings of the world are being replaced by the nothings that are so much easier to produce. The field of education is a bit tougher to find these differences between something and nothing, but I will do my best to try. In the education field, there are so many differences that occur throughout each individual state, country, or continent. Each country has the right to deal with education how they see fit. Whether or not those decisions are for the best of each student is a different story. The case of the United States and China is interesting. No country is perfect in that they make important decisions in the students' futures. I do believe that everyone tries to make the best informed choices they can, with the students in the best interests at heart. Between the United States and China, they both had similar paths. I feel that China is doing its best to keep up with what we are doing here in the United States. In the United States, they got the ball rolling after parents of children with disabilities fought for their students' rights. China's culture is not the same as the United States in the fact that we are more understanding of the students who are in special education. I think it is more common here, and we have more programs and services to help these students. China is so gifted in their general education classrooms to produce really talented, educated students. We do here in the United States as well, but in my opinion, education is valued more greatly in China. They are so gifted that it may be hard for them to understand or accept that there are many students with disabilities that they may reject. I hate to say it, but in China, I feel their general education students are their prized something. They are respected and valued. And their special education students are nothing. They are almost shameful or rejected. In fact, in their eyes, according to Reitzer, general education students could possibly be considered the nothings because they are so common, and the special education students are the somethings because they are the minority. Either way you decide to look at it, China needs to get their act together and do what is right for all students, special education students and general education students alike. It is not the child's fault that they have a disability that impacts their learning, but they have the same right to education as students without the disability.